Okay, now we're going to talk about another conservative president, George W. Bush. So during this time, we see a lot of political polarization with more traditional religious and limited or anti government rural areas, and many suburban areas went Republican. There was the shift of Southern white conservatives after the 1960s from the Democratic to Republican Party, which transformed American politics. In the 1990s, Southern conservatives took over leadership of the Republican Party, making it much more conservative and partisan. It was also more diverse, large urban centers, and internationally minded coasts voting Democrat. And in state legislatures, both parties gerrymandered congressional districts in order to create, quote, safe seats, which rewarded partisanship and discouraged compromise within Congress, which is why we see a lot of the problems we see today. As for the election of 2000, it was the closest election since 1876 and the first ever to be settled by the Supreme Court. Democrats nominated Al Gore on the right, who was President Clinton's vice president, and Senator Joseph Lieberman of Connecticut, who was running as his running mate. They were seen as champions of working families. Republicans nominated the son of George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, who was the governor of Texas, and his running mate was Dick Cheney. They ran as a compassionate conservative. Both candidates fought over the moderate and independent vote. The Green Party had Ralph Nader running a distant third. Gore received more than 500,000 more popular votes nationwide than Bush, but victory hinged on who won Florida's 25 electoral votes. Bush led by only 537 popular votes in Florida after a partial recount. Then the Democrats asked for manual recounts of the error-prone punch cards. The Supreme Court of Florida ordered recounts of all the votes, but the U.S. Supreme Court overruled them in a split 5-4 decision that matched the party loyalty of the justices. In Bush v. Gore, the majority ruled that the varying standards used in Florida's recount violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Al Gore ended the election crisis by accepting the ruling. Governor Bush won with 271 electoral votes against Gore's 266. There was one elector who abstained from voting. So Bush on domestic policies pushed a conservative agenda. He focused on tax cuts, deregulation, federal aid to faith-based organizations, pro-life legislation, being able to choose your school, privatization of Social Security and Medicare, drilling for oil and gas in Alaska, and voluntary environmental standards for the industry. As for domestic policies, Republicans created tax cuts. In 2001, there was $1.35 trillion tax cuts spread out over 10 years. They lowered the top tax bracket, gradually eliminating estate taxes, increasing the child tax credit and limits for individual retirement accounts and 401k contributions, and they gave all taxpayers an immediate tax rebate. In 2003, there were tax cuts for stock dividends, capital gains, and married couples. Democrats criticized the tax cuts for giving most of the benefits to the richest 5% of the population and for contributing to the doubling of the national debt during the Bush presidency from about $5 trillion to $10 trillion. George W. Bush also created a lot of education and health reform, like No Child Left Behind. This aimed to improve student performance and close the gap between well-to-do and poor students in the public schools through testing of all students nationwide, granting students the right to transfer to better schools, funding stronger reading programs, and training high-quality teachers. This is why we have the SOLs. Republicans passed laws to give seniors in Medicare the option to enroll in private insurance companies, and Republicans provided prescription drug coverage for seniors. Democrats criticized the legislation as primarily designed to profit insurance and drug companies. There were also economic bubbles and corruption. In 2002, the stock market crashed, and the Dow Jones Industrial Average fell by 38%. Unemployment rate climbed to 6%, and the number of people living in poverty increased. Enron and WorldCom were two companies that had cooked their books, aka falsified stated earnings and profits with the help of accounting companies. The Federal Reserve cut their interest rates to 1.25%, the lowest they had been in 50 years. And this speculative housing bubble of people moving their money to real estate from 2002 to 2007. We also have the war on terrorism. The roots of terrorism included the U.S. being faulted by many in the Arab world for siding with Israel in the deadly cycle of Palestinian terror bombings and Israeli reprisals. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire, which was Islamic, was replaced by Western-style secular nation-states. Religious fundamentalists were anti-modernization and the corruption of the House of Islam. The House of Islam was an ancient Islamic ideal of a realm governed by the precepts of the Quran and Sharia law. The stationing of U.S. troops in the Middle East after the Gulf War was seen as another violation of Middle Eastern lands. And Islamic extremists like Osama bin Laden and supporters of al-Qaeda preached jihad, which was holy war against the Jews and Crusaders to restore an Islamic caliphate or realm from Africa and the Middle East through East Asia. They had restrictive economic and political conditions in the Middle East, also providing a fertile breeding ground for recruiting extremists against that. In 1993, there was a truck bombing of the World Trade Center in New York City, which killed 6 people. In 1998, the U.S. responded to the terrorist bombing of 2 U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania by bombing al-Qaeda camps in Afghanistan and Sudan. Osama bin Laden was the leader of al-Qaeda. He fled to Afghanistan and allied himself with the Taliban. The Taliban was a group of Islamic fundamentalists who had taken over Afghanistan. In 2000, 2 suicide bombers in a small rubber boat nearly sank a $1 billion warship, the USS Cole, which was docked in Yemen at the time. On September 11, 2001, there were coordinated attacks by al-Qaeda terrorists in commercial airlines on the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York City and the Pentagon, and a 4th plane that had crashed in Pennsylvania. This claimed nearly 3,000 lives and galvanized public opinion unlike anything else since Pearl Harbor. So Bush wanted bin Laden and other al-Qaeda leaders dead or alive following 9/11. The Taliban refused to return bin Laden and his associates. So in fall 2001, the Taliban government was overthrown quickly by U.S. bombings, U.S. Special Forces, and Afghan troops in the anti-Taliban Northern Alliance. The U.S.-supported leader, Hamid Karzai, became the head of government in Kabul. Afghanistan remained unstable and divided by the Taliban insurgency and tribal conflicts. As for Homeland Security, we have the Patriot Acts of 2001 and 2003, which gave unparalleled powers to the U.S. government to obtain information and expand surveillance and arrest people. They were troubled by unlimited wiretaps, collection of records about cell phone calls and emails, the use of military tribunals to try suspects accused of terrorism, and the imprisonment of suspects indefinitely at the U.S. prison in Guantanamo, Cuba. The Department of Homeland Security was created, which combined more than 20 federal agencies with 170,000 employees, including the Secret Service, the Coast Guard, and ones dealing with customs and immigration. Bush's foreign policy included working with European nations to expand the European Union and NATO. He supported the admission of China to the World Trade Organization. He brokered conflicts between India and Pakistan. He refused to join the Kyoto Accord to prevent global warming. He walked out of a UN conference on racism. He abandoned the 1972 anti-ballistic missile treaty with Russia. He would not negotiate with North Korea or Iran. And the Bush Doctrine was the old policies of containment and deterrence were no longer effective in a world of stateless terrorism. In 2002, at his State of the Union address, Bush singled out Iraq, North Korea, and Iran as the axis of evil. He pursued a preemptive attack on Iraq before Saddam Hussein could build and distribute weapons of mass destruction, both nuclear and biological, to terrorists. In 2002, as well, Secretary of State Powell negotiated an inspection plan with the UN Security Council, which Iraq accepted. The UN inspectors failed to find any weapon of mass destruction. In 2003, Bush had declared Iraq had not complied with numerous UN resolutions. So on March 19th, 2003, we started air attacks on Iraq without support of the UN Security Council. In less than 4 weeks, the U.S. armed forces, with the support of the British and other allies, overran the Iraqi forces, captured Baghdad, and ended Hussein's dictatorship. They still didn't find any weapons of mass destruction. This was known as Operation Iraqi Freedom. There were diverse groups of insurgents, Sunni followers of the former dictator, Shiite militias, and foreign fighters, including Al-Qaeda, which continued to attack U.S. and allied troops and one another, which is the big reason that we are still involved there today. In the election of 2004, the Democrats nominated Senator John Kerry of Massachusetts. The Republicans nominated Bush again, energized their conservative base on issues like the war against terrorism, more tax cuts, and opposition to gay marriage and abortion. Bush received 51% of the popular vote and captured 286 electoral votes to Kerry's 252. Republicans also expanded their majorities in the Senate and House and continued to gain on the state level, especially in the South, and the party was at its strongest since the 1920s. So in 2005, the Iraqis held their first election, created a national assembly, and selected a prime minister and cabinet ministries, but the violence continued. In early 2007, we sent a surge of an additional 30,000 troops. By late 2008, militia violence and American deaths were down in Iraq, and the U.S. had started to turn over control of the provinces to the Iraqi government. In Afghanistan, the Taliban stepped up its attacks. So as for politics at home, Bush appointed 2 conservatives to the Supreme Court, John Roberts, who became the new Chief Justice, and Samuel Alito. In August 2005, Hurricane Katrina hit the Gulf Coast and flooded New Orleans. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, failed to anticipate and respond to this crisis. More than 1,000 people died, and tens of thousands of others, mostly poor people, were left in desperate conditions. The Republican congressional scandals involving bribery, perjury, and obstruction of justice led to the Democrats winning control of both houses of Congress in 2006. From 2002 to 2007, a housing boom fueled by subprime and fraudulent mortgage lending and a runaway real estate speculation. Wall Street firms packaged these high-risk loans into a variety of complex investments and then sold them to unsuspecting investors around the world. As housing prices began to dip, the bubble burst. Prices then collapsed, foreclosures climbed, and investments worth trillions of dollars lost value. Investors panicked, which caused many banks and financial institutions to fail, which led to a credit crisis because banks either lacked funds or were afraid to make loans to businesses and consumers necessary for the day-to-day functioning of the economy. A really good movie to watch on this is The Big Short. It is rated R, but highly recommend it for explaining what happened with this housing boom in the Great Recession. Gas prices soared to more than $4 per gallon. The stock market declined more than 40%. There was rising unemployment, and in 2008, the federal government tried a $170 billion stimulus package and took over a few critical financial institutions like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. In September of 2008, the bankruptcy of the Lehman Brothers, which was a Wall Street investment bank, led to a panic in the financial industry. The Economic Stabilization Act of 2008 gave $700 billion of Troubled Assets Relief Program, or TARP, to purchase failing assets that included mortgages and mortgage-related securities from financial institutions. Conservatives attacked TARP as socialism, while liberals attacked it as a bailout of the Wall Street executives who had caused all the problems.